welcome everyone to meeting number 142 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, October 29, 2024, the committee is commencing its study of the privacy practices of delivery and rideshare applications. And I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour today from the Rideshare Drivers Association of Ontario. I've got Mr. George Wedge, who's the president. Welcome, Mr. Wedge, and thank you for your patience. Aussi, j'avais Monsieur Hamel.
Mr. Hamel, Jonathan Hamel, is also with us, Public Affairs Manager at Uber.
Witness who was already in the room. So I've invited her to come to this first panel, which is going to give us a little bit more time with our witnesses today. Because of the votes, we're already 40 minutes past our scheduled time to start. So we've also got, and I'm going to go back, and I apologize to the interpreters for hitting the microphone here, Vaz Bednar, who is the Executive Director, Master of Public Policy in Digital Society Program at McMaster University. Thank you for your patience, Ms. Bednar. I'm going to start with Mr. Wedge. I expect that we could go, and it'll be up to the committee members if they don't have any further questions. We could go till between 5:30 and 5:45. And what I'll do, as we have in the past customary, I'm going to reset and allow for 6-minute questions from our friends from the bloc and the NDP once we get past this first round. Okay, so we've done that in the past. I don't expect there to be any problems with that. So I'm going to start. Mr. Wedge, you have up to 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead, sir, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and honourable members of this committee. Thank you for this invitation to share the inconvenient and unfortunate truths about the gig industry and specifically rideshare technologies operating in Canada. My name is George Wedge, and I am the President-at-Large of the Rideshare Drivers Association of Ontario, commonly known as RDAO. RDAO is an organizing, advocacy, and lobbyist association where our mission is to help governments on all levels understand how the rideshare industry is negatively impacting the lives of citizens, whether they are consumers or service providers, and to help drivers unite for the purposes of helping all levels of government see their way to bylaws, regulations, and bills to prevent a monopolistic industry from driving the average wages of blue-collar workers down to third-world levels. In October of this year, Canadian HR Reporter reported that more than 1 in 5, or 22%, of Canadians are participating in gig work of various kinds across the country. That equates to about 7.3 million adults finding work outside of regular employment. Specific to rideshare here in Ontario, there are well in excess of 120,000 drivers. The number of rideshare drivers in Ontario pales in comparison to the number of delivery drivers that we have in Ontario that depend on one of the fastest growing industries in Canada, the gig industry. RDAO estimates that 25% of rideshare drivers are full-time drivers. They rely on their net proceeds to feed, clothe, and house their families. This is the group of drivers most damaged by the unchecked, unregulated, monopolistic, and exploitive tech giants. An overwhelmingly large percentage of rideshare drivers in Ontario are new Canadians, having come here to find a better life, many coming from third world and conflict countries. The big question: after generations of labour movements helped establish workers' rights and minimum wages, how is it possible that more than 1 million Canadians are forced to accept hourly earnings well below the standard? The simple answer is a lack of transparency. Median hourly wages after expenses and vehicle depreciation for rideshare drivers in Canada is as low as $6.37 per hour, as reported in the peer-reviewed report titled Legislated Poverty. Uber and Lyft use marketing campaigns and cash incentives to lure unsuspecting drivers into the rideshare driving and gig work industry with vague promises of earnings that simply do not materialize. Recently in the U.S., Lyft settled with the FTC on a $2.1 million US civil fine for misleading prospective drivers. RDAO can't imagine that Uber is immune on this issue, and we speculate that their day is already circled on the FTC calendar. Today was a very important day for RDAO. In the City of Toronto, a report was submitted to the Executive Council that was based on 1.5 years of study of the vehicle for hire industry. In that report, we expected to see recommendations that would make the vehicle for hire industry in Toronto, specifically for rideshare and for taxi drivers and limousine drivers. We expected to see a roadmap in there that would create sustainability and wages that could support blue-collar workers. Unfortunately, it didn't materialize exactly the way we expected. We saw 2 of the 3 pillars that are required for the roadmap, but the third one is currently missing. There's a lot for us to do in that area. In October 8th of this year, Uber activated its newest feature. It's called upfront fares, where typically in the industry there's a rate card that estimates a fare for a rider and the payout for a driver based on distance and time, which is what's been Uber has used since their installation into Ontario some 9 years ago. October 8th of this year, Uber activated something called upfront fares. There is no rate card. Instead, upfront fares is a 3-part feature. The first part of the feature is where the driver gets to get all of the information for the ride that he expects to see, who he's picking up, where they're going, and how long it's going to take them. So the artificial part of this now is they're using AI that looks at the rider, looks at all of their information, all of their history, and it decides what's the maximum amount they can be charged. And then it looks at the driver and does exactly the opposite. What's the minimum amount they'll accept?
I'm sure that some members will have some questions during the rounds, Mr. Wedge. That concludes the 5 minutes. Next, prochaine, Monsieur Hamel, vous avez...
Mr. Hamel, you have up to 5 minutes to make a statement.
Congratulate you for what is, in my opinion, the most beautiful sweater in all of sports, hanging behind you there, Monsieur Hamel. So, commencez, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
Please go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Jonathan Hamel, and I'm a Public Affairs Manager for Uber in Canada. It's a pleasure to be here with you today for your study on delivery services. Uber is driven by the mission to help people go anywhere, get anything, and earn their way. Uber has helped people save time while moving around safely and conveniently. It has created new business opportunities for restaurants, tourism, and other local businesses, and provided flexible earning opportunities for drivers and delivery people wherever Uber operates in Canada. Uber Eats first started in Toronto in 2015 and is now available in over 300 cities in all provinces and 2 territories. It is a 3-sided marketplace made up of Canadians. There's the consumer, the restaurant, and the delivery person. I'll speak briefly about all 3. Delivery platforms like Uber Eats help regular Canadians access good quality, local food, regardless of how busy their lives are or what the weather is outside. After a long, busy day at work, school, or caregiving, Canadians turn to Uber Eats to get a meal or to order groceries. Almost half of Canadians reported using delivery apps to order food or essential items. Convenience was listed as the most important reason people used Uber Eats. Uber Eats helps local restaurants grow their business. Thousands of restaurants and other merchants choose to be on Uber Eats because we're providing services they value, from delivery services to marketing and to reaching new customers and growing their customer base. Just this past year, 85% of Canadian merchants say that Uber Eats gives them access to an additional revenue stream, and they've increased their revenue since joining the platform. 70% said that Uber Eats has a positive impact on their business's ability to manage current economic challenges in Canada. 86% say that Uber Eats helped increase their business's ability to reach new customers they otherwise would not have been able to reach. 93% say they plan to keep partnering with Uber Eats a year from now. Delivery people choose the Uber Eats platform because of the flexibility it gives them. They can earn money on their own terms. They control where and when they work. They are free to use other apps like DoorDash, Skip, or Instacart at the same time as they're on Uber, choose which deliveries to accept, and they can deliver using their own vehicle, by bike, or on foot. It is this unparalleled flexibility that draws a diverse group of people to Uber, including newcomers, parents, caregivers, students, retirees, entrepreneurs, and more. As more Canadians turn to Uber to earn flexibly, whether as drivers or delivery people, we believe we need to level up this work. That's why 3 years ago, we signed a landmark national agreement with UFCW Canada, the country's largest private sector union. We've been working with the union to do two things. First, drivers and delivery persons can request representation from the union when facing an account issue or deactivation with Uber or Uber Eats. Those services are offered free of charge. And in the first 2 years of our agreement, 1,908 workers have had their issues filed, and 457 of them had a positive outcome. We've been advocating for labor reforms that protect flexibility and offer tailored benefits for this type of work, like a minimum earning standard, a benefits fund, notice of termination, health and safety protections, and representation services. BC just implemented 120% minimum earnings guarantee, and Ontario will put one in place next year. In closing, we've come a long way since our first trip in Canada in 2012. We have gone very fast, sometimes too fast, but we have weathered the storms and learned from our mistakes. Today, we're listening to people who use the platform, drivers, delivery persons, and cities, on how we can make the platform better. I look forward to answering your questions.
Votre déclaration.
Thank you for your statement, Mr. Hamel. Ms. Bédard, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to this committee for the honor of appearing. You heard that I run the Master of Public Policy program at McMaster University. I'm also a contributing columnist for the Globe and Mail's Report on Business, writing monthly about technology and public policy, where I have written about algorithmic pricing. The title was "Algorithms Are Raising Prices for Everything. This Must Stop." I don't write the headlines. I also host Lately, which is the Globe and Mail's weekly business podcast, and I co-host CG's policy show, Policy Prompt. And finally, I am the co-author of a book about competition in Canada. It's called The Big Fix, How Companies Capture Markets and Hurt Canadians. My co-author is Denise Hearn. I tell you that to sort of contextualize and offer that I'm coming to the committee as a thinker, as somebody who can sort of maybe offer a broader context for these trends. One of the chapters in this book, it's one of my favorite, it's called Add to Cart Trust. Now, it was excerpted in the Walrus, if you're looking for something to scroll on during committee. But I want to mention it not to give you something to click on, but because that text reminds the reader that today the prices of most goods, right, and some services, as we're hearing, are not set by humans, but by automatic processes, algorithms. And the use of these systems and their terms are rarely disclosed to shoppers, though the aim is often to extract the highest possible price from them. Using intrusive personal data, so this is sometimes called surveillance pricing, that data is sometimes acquired directly through interactions with consumers, so voluntarily shared or collected as sort of some of their exhaust, right? More often purchased through third-party data brokers. Companies now know our intimate spending habits and can calculate our maximum willingness to pay. We also state that online personalized pricing ends up being a little bit of a different beast, right? It requires the use of highly invasive data collection and personal identification techniques. Now, this kind of sophisticated price calibration, it's happening much more often without any sort of consumer consent, disclosure, or labeling. I've also contributed to journalism covering some of the recent Uber price change called upfront pricing, which you heard about. This strategy removes the proximate kind of predictability or some level of predictability regarding pay that drivers previously had. And back in 2022, I should have said this earlier, I did do some broader work on gig work regulation for the province of Ontario, focusing on gig workers as a member of Ontario's Workforce Recovery Advisory Committee. During that time, in my private time, I delivered for Instacart. I wanted to have the direct experience of having an algorithm for a boss. And if you want to chat about that later, I didn't like it very much. I resent, so much how so much of pricing for consumers, for workers in these monopsonistic gig contexts, has become an algorithmic hall of mirrors. A columnist who writes for The Atlantic, Charlie Wartzel, he called this pricing hell in a recent column that I really appreciated. And I, at the same time, find myself quite encouraged by the policy progress, not just in the US, but also in Canada, on ending junk fees, right? We've had a newish kind of focus on identifying and eliminating these. I'll wrap by telling you a little bit about junk fees and pricing and how they fit into gig work. So when the FTC took on junk fees, they mentioned the following, and forgive me, all of this is a direct quote again, so it's like the researcher came and she read us things, but she's ready to talk later. Food delivery apps are notorious for obfuscating delivery and service fees. A recent survey showed that one company's hidden fee burden is about 15% of transaction volume. That company received $288 million in orders in 2021 in the US and had an average sale price of $31. When you put those numbers together, the company collected about $1.3 billion from consumers in junk fees, right? Fake fees, irrational fees passed on to people. Using the most conservative assumptions, a similar calculation for a competitor, which in the same survey had a hidden fee rate of 7.5%, produces about $1.5 billion. In addition, the leading grocery delivery service had about $25 billion in transaction volume, with about 8% of that being junk fees. So based on the best publicly available information, and again, a lot of this is quite opaque, junk fees in food delivery are an estimated $5 billion annually across the country, though that country is the US. So I've read your motion. I know that you are in the process of and preparing to study more deeply what these fees are, how they are calculated, what is explained to end users and what is not, and whether they are ultimately reasonable. And I look forward to contributing to your discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Bednar, I think. There was some reaction there when you were talking about those fees. I'm sure there'll be some questions on that, so be prepared. Mr. Barrett's going to start us off with our 6-minute round. Mr. Barrett, go ahead.
Mr. Mel, how many annual users do you have?
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for your question. Through you, Mr. Chairman. The question was on the number of users, meaning drivers and delivery persons, or passengers and riders?
The people that the drivers bring the things to. Move around.
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chairman. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Canadians who use our platform in the course of a year. Unfortunately, I don't have more precise numbers with me at the moment.
Okay. Will you undertake to provide the precise numbers to the committee?
Merci pour votre...
Thank you for your question. Through you, Mr. Chairman, I have taken note of the question, and I'll see what we can do.
We'll register that as a yes. For how long do you store user data?
Merci pour votre...
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Just a reply would be much appreciated.
Monsieur-
For how long do you store the data?
Attends, j'arrête le temps. Monsieur,
I'm stopping the clock. Mr. Amel, I don't think this is the first time that you're appearing before a parliamentary committee. In this committee, we can have direct communication between the witnesses and the members, so you can answer Mr. Barrack directly. Let's bear in mind that members have little time to put their questions and witnesses have little time to answer. So this is how we'll proceed today.
you had a question. I haven't started your time. Pose the question. Je pense qu'il y a un peu de problème.
I think there's a bit of a problem with the interpretation, since there seems to be a lot of time for the questions. I will give members more time. If you have questions for Mr. Amel, I don't know why there seems to be a lag. Mr. Barrett, go ahead, please.
For how long do you store users' data?
Thank you. Yes, this is, in fact, the first time I appear before a committee. For consumers, when they cancel their accounts, data are kept for 90 days, except if there are reasons to delete them for security, fraud prevention, compliance, or other issues. For drivers and delivery persons, we have, for financial reasons and potential insurance claims, that time can be extended so that we can be in compliance with our obligations under the legislation.
Do you sell or share anonymized or non-anonymized user or employee data to advertisers or any third party?
I'll be very clear. We sell no data to third parties. There may be cases, to be precise, for example, where police may contact our specialized team. At Uber, we have a highly specialized team that manages data, and it works with police. When police make a request, and of course that takes a very formal legal framework, when they apply for data on a specific case, if they need the data for an investigation, in those cases we may share it.
How many instances of breaches of user data have occurred in Canada?
À ma connaissance,
To my knowledge, there was one in 2016.
Users were affected.
je n'ai pas cette information.
I don't have that information. I don't have it with me.
What is your process for notifying users whose information has been accessed or compromised by a third party in an unauthorized manner?
Ce que je peux vous dire,
What I can tell you on this is that when there was a breach in 2016, every user whose personal data had been accessed by a third party were notified. Each party was notified. I can't tell you the exact mechanism that was used to do that, but I can provide that information.
Merci, Monsieur Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Hamel, I believe we'll be following up with you so that you can provide answers to Mr. Barrett's questions. The clerk will follow up with you.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses who have appeared today. I'll start with Mr. Hamel, if that's okay. Mr. Hamel, there was a strike in Brampton in the public service that included the transit folks, and Uber decided to put forward a massive surcharge. Why was that?
Merci pour votre question. Donc, le fonctionnement de la tarification dynamique chez Uber.
The way that the system works is at the heart of what we do. We are dealing with a market, and we want the market to be in balance. On one hand, we have drivers who want to move people, work, and provide a service.
The people that use the transit in the GTA in Brampton specifically are those that don't have vehicles, that don't have access, and your company decided to take advantage of them to get to work. Can you help me understand why that was? What are the moral compass? What is the moral compass that your company conducts itself with?
Donc, la tarification.
Dynamic pricing works in the following way. When there's an increase in the number of persons who want a ride, the prices go up and drivers are more interested in accepting a fare. When there are more drivers available or fewer drivers available, not everyone can get a ride. Drivers see very tangibly on their app. They see the zone where there's dynamic pricing in effect. So drivers interested in working with that, they move to that zone.
So how much of that surcharge went to the drivers and how much of it went to the companies?
Donc,
when dynamic pricing applies, when a passenger takes a more expensive trip or a trip that's more expensive than it might otherwise be, the same percentages apply. The driver sees a higher income with dynamic pricing.
And how do you know what, maybe I'll turn to Ms. Bednar for this question. Ms. Bednar, you talked about artificial intelligence and its role in all of this. And what happened in Brampton with the strike and then the surcharges that were applied, how much of a role does artificial intelligence have to play with that? And what do you think we need to do as a government to ensure that companies like Uber are not gouging the middle class that are trying to get to work because of challenges of getting there?
I can't speak in detail to how those fees were determined during the strike, and I actually don't know their nomenclature. So obviously, if you want to characterize the surge portion of that pricing as being a junk fee, right, something that is passed on to people because the company can do that, then yes, you know, these systems, these computer programs, these algorithms absolutely have a role in that. There are places where we accept surge pricing or expect surge pricing, but we're not having the broader policy conversation, right? Cineplex has recently been experimenting with an extra $1 charge on opening weekend of a movie. You know, do we have an appetite for that? Do we have enough choice? But I think focusing on maybe that connection between through competition, false and misleading advertising, as well as consumer protection that occurs at the provincial level. I think we have very promising tools to respond to this and have kind of more robust policy conversations.
Thank you. Mr. Wedge, you had spoken about the relationship between the consumer, the restaurant, the delivery person. Where's the morality in how organizations like Uber, like Lyft, or many others, in how they conduct themselves with those surcharges, and how they treat their drivers?
Well, we'll start with the treating their drivers. They don't acknowledge we exist. To speak with Uber, we might get, the only contact we have with Uber is a third party that they use for complaints, and they're never helpful. They just read from script. The morality in the pricing, the drivers feel like they're trash. They'll be asked to do a delivery, for example, up to 15, 20 kilometers for $3. So no one can survive on that, whether you're on foot, on a scooter, or in a car. So we feel for consumers because we know that they get charged so much money. But what they don't understand is we get paid so little. So when we see a surge, our drivers are happy because they feel they're actually getting what they deserve to get for the ride.
And what happens when a consumer returns the goods? Does the driver actually get any compensation for that?
So return goods, I can speak to the food portion. It's usually a driver who brings it back, and the reason they bring it back is the address was wrong, no one answered the door, and the driver, if they complain, will get a return fee for bringing it back to the restaurant.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Khalid. We were 45 seconds over there. I wanted to give him a chance to ask that or answer that question. Monsieur Villemure pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Villemure, 6 minutes. Mr. Wedge, in your statement, you talked about upfront fares, and you were about to explain that the driver receives the minimum that he'll accept.
Yes, so the thing about that was that the artificial intelligence, what we call black box pricing, it exploits both the consumer and the driver in that case. It looks to the consumer who wants the ride or the service, and it looks at their history and everything else, all the available data, time of day, is there a surge on, and will charge them the maximum amount it thinks they will accept. And then it looks at the driver, does exactly the opposite. How bad is their day? How low is their rating? What's the minimum amount that driver will accept for that bit of business? And that's how it works. And then, of course, Uber takes everything in the middle. So what we're seeing is a sliding scale of commission. The longer you drive, the farther you go, the less you make per kilometer, the more they make.
Ça s'apparente à de l'exploitation.
That seems like real exploitation.
It absolutely is exploitation on all levels.
D'accord, merci beaucoup. Monsieur Hamel.
Thank you. Mr. Hamel, I'll begin by saying that I don't esteem your company because it seems to be using a slavery model. You were in politics before going into Uber. Yes, with the Quebec government. What were you doing? I worked for a variety of ministers and opposition members and the office of Premier Couillard. Were you involved in negotiations with Uber at the time? No, never. How would you qualify the corporate culture at Uber? Our vision at Uber is to provide choice. I meant the culture, not the mission. Well, that's our vision. Our culture is to provide people who want to work flexibly an option allowing them to do that. Canadians appreciate flexibility tremendously, those who use the app, that is. Over 90% of them say that the main reason they appreciate working that way is flexibility. Since Uber came into being, even when Mr. Travis Kalanick was there, he was the founder, I believe, there has been social and moral tension, if I can call it that. Are those ethical and moral tensions still there? I was listening to Mr. Wedge and Ms. Bednar, who paint two very different pictures from yours. At Uber, we've moved from a confrontational mode to a cooperative mode. In Quebec, 4 times a year, with the government, we sit with all stakeholders in the industry to discuss all the issues. We are really in cooperative mode. Over the past 3 years, we have an agreement, a 2-part agreement with the largest private sector union to provide better representation for drivers and delivery persons. And we also put a proposal forward to provincial governments, which is based on discussions with drivers and delivery persons, begun in 2020. If I may interrupt, we don't have much time. This dynamic pricing, upfront pricing, the least possible amount for the driver and the highest possible amount for the rider, which is exploitation. How do you explain that? Basically, Uber, in the name of demand, is exploiting the weakness of workers. Workers appreciate the flexibility. We are managing a market. Drivers are not our employees. We don't have vehicle expenditures. We want the market to be free. On one hand, we have the drivers, and on the other, there are people who need to travel. So the two have to meet. What we need very much to bear in mind is this: for the app to work, drivers must continue working and must continue accepting rides. But these two sides don't meet in the middle. I was listening to Mr. Wedge. You say they meet in the middle, but do they? I have some difficulty with the gap between these two explanations. When I say they meet in the middle, because in practical terms, before confirming the ride, the person who wishes to travel will know exactly what they will have to pay. So the person asking for the ride is ready to pay that amount. We should also bear in mind that drivers and delivery persons have total flexibility. They can refuse rides. They are never obliged to accept a ride. They can refuse. Would you agree in saying that if a customer is ready to accept the price of the ride, that's one thing, but do you think the customer knows how much the driver will get for that ride? I don't use Uber, so I'm asking, is there a way for the rider to know how much the driver gets? The passenger does not know how much the driver gets for the ride. Do you think the customer or the rider should know? That's a good question. What's important, I believe, is for the driver to know. We were talking about upfront pricing. So before accepting a ride, the driver knows in BC and Ontario how much he or she will earn.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. I'd really like the opportunity. First, I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Mr. Wedge, I want to have the opportunity to really center those most impacted by that, and that's the workers. When you arrived, you started in your remarks and you talked about the way in which there is profiling, data, algorithmic profiling of both the rider and the driver for the maximum exploitation to drive profits. You gave me an example of coming here from the airport. I want you to just start with that and expand on what that might look like.
Sure, absolutely. So, of course, I took an Uber from the airport to this committee today, and it was a new Canadian who picked me up. a lady driver, and I asked her a little bit about her experience. Her English was very limited. She asked if I could speak some French. She was from Syria, and I asked her how was her experience, what does she think of the new upfront fare, but more importantly, I asked her, I said, how much are you being paid today to drive me to this committee? And she said, oh, $10. I said, well, I'm paying $27. So there was a substantial gap.
So not just, that's a significant order of magnitude above, like the person who's actually delivering the value in the service versus what they're being paid and what the company is profiting by. So this goes beyond service fees. In your estimation, for the work that you do, the investments that your drivers have to put in, they're paying for their, obviously the depreciating costs on their cars, their insurance, their gas. In your estimation, it was characterized by Mr. Hamill that you weren't actually employees. I just want you to talk a little bit about, you know, what do you consider your relationship to be with a company like Uber or Lyft or any of the other rideshare apps?
Our relationship with Uber is no different than it is with any employer. They're going to put a piece of work in front of us and they're going to say, do you want it? And we say yes. We don't get to negotiate the terms. We have no ability to defer this work to someone that works for us. We consider it to be an employer-employee relationship, just the province has not found their way there yet.
You spoke about a roadmap for rideshare of Toronto. You didn't mention what the pillars were. Very briefly, because time is tight, can you please talk about the two pillars that were delivered in Toronto and the third that you think is, because again, this is going to go to committee for recommendation, so what's the third pillar as well?
So the first pillar that they found was that they have to somehow right-size the fleet for the business that exists in Toronto. That's the first pillar. Second pillar was that they have to understand that the wage discrimination for rideshare drivers in Toronto exists and what it is, and see what they can do to remedy that. That's the second pillar. The third pillar was to make it a driver-centric licensing system versus issuing all of the license to the large tech apps, because it enslaves us to work for them.
So to be clear, the City of Toronto currently is giving licensing to the tech apps who are then leasing it back to the drivers?
It's not exactly leased. It's theirs, and then issued to us if we meet all of the requirements to drive for them.
Like an employer to me, and that's a very important distinction to make in this. Ms. Bednar, you wrote the book on the big fix, how companies capture markets and harm Canadians. Can you also talk about ways in which Uber, Lyft, and others, Amazon, have worked to provide what I would call regulatory capture of legislation, whether it's at the municipal level or ways that there are gaps federally that seem to be outside of the control of our regular labor laws, and I would even argue tax laws. But can you just speak to why you think companies are able to capture the markets, and what role does capturing some of the regulation also play in that?
I mean, there's a book I read by the first lobbyist for Uber who sort of talked about their strategy at the time, which I understand has evolved over time. So I'm not a direct expert on regulatory capture. I have done some work on it, and it does occur occasionally where some, legislation can be seen as legitimizing for a new form of business, right? And large companies or any kind of company may have particular interests. But a lot of what we're seeing defies the kind of economics 101. Your colleague asked me earlier, what else, what other policy tools do we have? In the pandemic under Premier Ford, the commission, the delivery commission, which tends to be 30% and stay at 30%, was lowered and temporarily capped. Now, one time when I wrote about price control, someone tweeted at me, the 70s called, they want their policy idea back. But you learn in Economics 101 when there's a new entrant to a marketplace, the price tends to go down. That 30% commission, if Uber Eats is in a marketplace and then Skip the Dishes comes and I guess, I roll in with my Instacart app, that commission stays at 30%. And that's what we've also heard from restaurants. We focused on the wages for workers and the price, but also those third parties really ends up hurting their business and why people encourage them to go directly. So that's another policy tool, another opportunity there.
Given your subject matter expertise on tech, in your opinion, do you think that there is adequate informed consent to the type of information that would be retained and used in the algorithms that would create a profile on me potentially as a passenger or Mr. Wedge as a driver? Do you think that in that process, in that basic commercial contract, that the consumer and the actual driver have the kind of adequate informed consent to allow their information that ultimately drives these prices.
I doubt it, but also for the workers, we heard about the depreciation of their pay. They don't have the privilege of understanding how that pay is determined. So we heard about their flexibility and their ultimate, this, word that's very attractive, choice. We've seen experiments where the same ride at the same time of day for the same distance is, micro-calculated and calibrated at a range of different fees. So we also hear from anecdotally drivers who feel they are penalized, right, for not accepting that ride. So you have a choice to not accept that ride, but there is a consequence for not taking that $10 ride from the airport, and that may be that the availability of work, which is controlled by the employer and not freely accessed to you, is depreciated.
Outstanding.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Green. That concludes round one. We're going to go to our 5-minute rounds. Liberals or Conservatives, followed by Liberals, 2.5 each for the bloc and the NDP. Mr. Caputo for 5. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Wedge, you talked about the maximum charge versus the minimum accepted. In a few seconds, can you just explain what you meant by that, please?
Well, so like I said, it'll look at that rider and see what they've experienced paying over their history for that ride, and then it maybe add a surcharge or a surge fee for the time of day. And then it looks at the driver, their desperation aspect, what's called their acceptance rate. As that gets low, you get in trouble with Uber. And then it will offer you what it thinks is the lowest amount you will accept based on your desperation to stay with Uber or just keep going on the platform.
Here, Mr. Cooper and I could both be Uber customers, and for the exact same trip, we will pay different prices.
Absolutely. And a group of drivers will all be offered a different amount for that same ride.
Wow. This is, I'm an Uber customer. I'll tell you, this came to me about 4 weeks ago when an Uber driver, I was going to the airport, there was surge pricing. I think I paid $45 or $50. I had to get there. And I believe we were just talking, and I believe the driver said he was getting something like $13, $15 for the trip. Does that sound right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Does that sound right, Monsieur Hamel?
J'ai pas ces données.
I'm sorry, I don't have those data in front of me, and I don't want to give figures.
Sir, you are the public relations officer. I think that you probably have a good idea of what things cost. So why don't you tell us, on average, what amount of a fare goes to the driver and what amount goes to Uber?
Donc,
The pricing varies with city, by province.
I think this question is very clear. What is the average? I don't care about cities. I don't care about surge pricing. Somebody at Uber knows, and you are here representing them. What is the average amount that goes to a driver as opposed to Uber? Surely you have that number.
il y a plusieurs facteurs.
There are a number of factors that need to be taken into account. One of those factors is the government rates that are paid in Quebec. Uber takes a service fee.
What's the average in Ontario?
Ontario and BC are two provinces where the driver, before accepting a ride, can see how much he or she will get. It's upfront pricing in those two provinces. Now,
I'm asking what I think is a very clear question here. And I don't want to hear about factors and things like that, because at the end of the day, there's an average. Regression moves towards the mean. We've all heard this in statistics, things like that. Even the NDP is agreeing with me. What is it in Ontario? What is it? Just please, just give us a number.
Okay, Monsieur Hamel. Monsieur Hamel, the réponse.
Mr. Hamel, could you answer, please? I cannot provide you with a figure. Every week, drivers are provided with a document showing all their income in great detail. Drivers have access to all the data, but I can't give you a figure now because I don't have it in front of me.
Mr. Chair, I know that my time is up, but I mean, we do need answers to these questions. I think they're fairly straightforward, and I would ask Mr. Amel, would you be prepared to provide the committee with the information I requested with the province-by-province breakdown, or if Uber likes a city-by-city breakdown, if that's a factor that's necessary?
Well, I think, Mr. Caputo, we're going to have to be clear on what you're asking for.
Sure. Let's do province by province.
Province par province, Monsieur Amel.
Province by province breakdown, Mr. Amel, an answer to Mr. Cooper's question, Caputo's question. And this is the third question for which the clerk will follow up with you. We will send an email with the questions put by committee members. Thank you.
Fisher, you have 5. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks again, as everyone has said, to all our witnesses for being here. So Uber drivers, Uber Eats drivers, all these gig workers work through bad weather, they work through rainstorms and snow. They're not just delivering a Big Mac. Some of them are delivering groceries, some of them are delivering medication, and they work through, day and night. I heard Mr. Amel say that drivers aren't employees. So I'm going to ask, excuse me, Mr. Wedge, these folks who are driving Ubers, what protections do they have, if any?
Under labor rights, there are none.
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 So we have a situation where these folks can make and do make. I mean, I know some do very, very well, but some don't. We have a situation where some people don't make the minimum wage. Ms. Bednar, I was going to ask you if you have a concern about AI-driven algorithmic pricing, and then I noticed that you wrote an opinion piece called "An Algorithm May Soon Decide Your Salary." So I'm assuming I know the answer to that question. What legislative or regulatory measures should be taken in Canada to better protect workers?
I have done some policy work on this, and this is a very contested space in terms of, is there room for a third category of dependent workers, dependent contractors, right, where you are fundamentally dependent on these algorithms, right, on these frameworks for the availability of work and for pricing. Right now, we've bifurcated labor into independent contractors or employees. There may also be a role, and I don't mean to be outlandish, but should these systems be publicly owned infrastructure, right? Should we have one system where we have set a wage floor and we are not abusing workers and sort of throttling their access to work and throttling their pay, but building digital public infrastructure that allows us to facilitate these sorts of deliveries in a particular way. I'm not suggesting directly, a Canada Post for gig work, but when I was working on Instacart, and I'll use the term working loosely because of how dependent I was on that algorithm, I was struck that I was delivering groceries to people with mobility or health issues or lone parents who didn't have a vehicle, and it made more sense for them to splurge or invest their money in that way. So it gave me a different appreciation of the utility, right, of some of these systems, but that doesn't mean that I am supportive of opaque, abusive algorithms.
Okay, so if I was, and Mr. Caputo talked about this a little bit, if I was willing and absolutely needed to get somewhere and was willing to pay surge pricing at 4:30 in the afternoon or 4 a.m., will there be algorithms that say that I have in the past been willing to pay that, and might that indicate a future willingness to pay a higher price, and that the algorithm may choose when I turn that app on to charge me more because I was once willing to do it? Is it that granular?
So the ad tech that we've come to expect as sort of the price of participation in kind of e-commerce, right, and the ads we see on social media have come to pricing and sort of work in that way. So I can't speak to the details of Uber's algorithm in particular, but I would, based on research that's out there and other analysis that's being done, say to you that yes, there are attempts to calibrate based on, estimations of your income, where you may live, what you've paid before, your history and tenure with the program, with the app.
Okay, so going back to the driver, same type of question. The algorithm, if they say no to a bunch of $7, $8, $9 rides, will they then, through the algorithm, presumably be punished so that they no longer are getting chosen for those jobs?
Workers have documented this. I would defer to others here. We did see an experiment of sorts in the U.S. where I believe it was DoorDash drivers coordinated over Facebook to game the algorithm, and they united in sort of saying no to very poorly priced jobs, and they found that they were able to exert some power over the algorithm and sort of elevate that wage floor. But here, again, I defer to other experts who have been drivers or worked with drivers in that way to speak to what they've been experiencing.
Yeah, we're at the end of our time, but I'm
okay.
going to give Mr. Wedge an opportunity. If you want to, 15, 30 seconds, Mr. Wedge, go ahead.
So, yes, we have seen exactly that, where drivers band together that don't accept the low pays, and then all of a sudden it starts to creep up. So we've even seen in this new algorithm that they're using that they've actually tipped the line of pay, where the short trips, which Uber had a hard time to fulfill in the past, drivers are actually being paid $1 more for the short trips.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Wedge. Monsieur Villemure, 2 minutes et 30 secondes.
Mr. Villemure, 2.5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Ms. Bednar, what's the impact of AI evolution on Uber operations?
What the research shows, and I'm sorry that my French is so poor, I can't respond unless you want to hear like rooms of a house and Halloween words. We have seen that, surveillance pricing, surveillance at work, that throttling of wages doesn't inspire people. It demoralizes people. It stresses them out, and it can also hurt their bodies, right? So there's all sorts of places, all other kinds of work that are also algorithmically managed, where we're treating people as if they are a computer. Amazon warehouses are infamous for this, right? The Amazon pick rate has gone up and up and up. And that is based on, statistically, what is in the realm of possibility for how many items I, as a potential Amazon factory worker, could possibly pick. So what is the effect? I mean, I would point to the morale, the trust, and the uncertainty that we hear about from drivers experiencing that volatility. At the same time, we also hear from people, and this is important, the lower barrier to entry, right? That's something we can all learn about the labor market, right? It welcomes people, and yes, it is easy to sort of sign up on your phone for something. Not every job in the labor market can be like that, but maybe there are other areas where the barrier to entry for entry-level jobs is too high and there's too much friction, and that demoralizes people too.
Avec les Amazon, justement.
With the Amazons and Ubers of this world, we seem to live in a monitored surveillance society the way George Orwell described in 1984. Is that the case?
I wouldn't discount that. We're seeing escalations of surveillance technology at work. There was a viral Reddit thread last week. I certainly go there to get some information talking about the growth of technologies for white-collar workers, right? So surveillance technology, should I be paid based on how quickly I respond to an email, how many keystrokes, how fast my mouse goes? The gentleman we heard from Uber, his workday, he has a predictable income. It doesn't depend on, how many meetings you join and things like that. And why have we datafied or over kind of quantified work? That is part of this conversation.
Merci beaucoup.
I have to say I got pretty excited when I heard about the idea of a digital public infrastructure. Mr. Wedge, we spoke about, as New Democrats, we believe that unions are the best way for people to be able to protect their rights, have well-paying jobs with benefits and pensions to be able to take care of themselves and their families. And yet, we know that the gig economy has decimated the ability to organize through organized labor. And so I suggested, that it might be appropriate for us to look at sectoral bargaining with a tripartite process that brought workers, private sector, and the government to the table to help lift the minimum conditions and allow people to be able to organize. Hearing what Ms. Bednar said, knowing the abilities of your membership, do you agree with the idea or the notion that there could be, or at least it's worth exploring and contemplating, a way in which the drivers have not just low impact access to it, but ultimately have the greatest share of the value that they create in delivering the service? So in other words, do you think that there's an opportunity to explore for a worker-owned cooperative model that allowed for public digital infrastructure to provide this type of service for people?
So the short answer is yes. In fact, we already have kind of a homegrown app that's coming out in Toronto. It wants to be socially responsible, and it's learning how to do it. But yeah, so the answer is yes. All we need is someone to answer the phone and tell a car to go pick someone up. We don't need all this fancy stuff. That means nothing to us.
So in the meantime, what responsibility would you suggest we have as legislators, although this is federal and it would probably have more provincial applications, but for sectoral bargaining on this, in your experience, do you think that adding unionized protection to workers would help against the exploitation that you see by allowing people to push back against decisions that are made or challenge these algorithms?
So organizing, if we had a true organizing effort with drivers, I'm sure we would get enough signatures to actually go and force collective bargaining through any employment standards across the country. If federally that can be helped along, where this committee or any other committee can get with provinces and say, this is really important, you have to put some mandates in place so that gig workers know who their fellow workers are so they can unite and organize if they so wish.
Is that your recommendation to this committee?
Absolutely, it is 100%.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wedge. Mr. Green, I'm going to go for the next 24 minutes. I'm going to offer 6-minute rounds to each of our members, and then we'll see where that takes us. But Mr. Cooper, are you okay with 6 minutes? Okay, go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hamel, if you could clarify with regards to upfront fares, if you're a Uber driver, you will know how much you're going to get paid for that ride, correct?
Effectivement, donc
Yes. At the moment in BC and Ontario, drivers receive a ride offer which indicates the amount that they will make on the ride and also the itinerary for the ride, the route.
Only in place presently in Ontario and British Columbia. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, but the driver would not know how much the customer is going to be charged for that ride. Am I right about that?
That is also correct. The driver sees the amount he or she will be paid and the route.
And so, really, although the driver knows how much they're going to make, this does absolutely nothing to inform the driver about whether they're getting what they might deem to be a reasonable share of the fare charged to the customer. Would you dispute that?
en fait, à chaque semaine,
Every week, Uber provides drivers with a document setting out in great detail what they've earned, the government rates, as well as service charges imposed by Uber. So it's fully transparent. Each week, every driver gets a detailed breakdown of their income.
I would just invite Mr. Wedge to comment on that.
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, the answer is yes. At the end of the week, after all the business has been done, the driver is informed what he can actually look and see what was his percentage take for the whole week. And I know I received one recently. My take was 39%. So all of the rest of that money went somewhere else, just not to me. But it's after the fact. So I don't know if I'm accepting that on full knowledge or not.
Absolutely. Now, just per you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Wedge, I had heard anecdotally that with respect to the upfront fares, that some Uber drivers actually find it problematic insofar as Uber uses algorithmic data to, for example, provide rides or that they can accept or not accept that are so-called low balls, and then that may impact upon whether or not how much business they they might receive from Uber. Is there any validity to that?
We have drivers who claim that they're being throttled a lot. We get that. And the fact is, you can't say no forever because Uber will dump you off the platform.
Right. And so you will be penalized.
Absolutely. They say you can accept or reject anyone you want. They just don't tell you what the ramifications are if your acceptance rate gets too low.
And in terms of your acceptance rate, are drivers incentivized or rewarded for accepting rides in which they take a lesser share?
From time to time, Uber will offer something called a quest, and that is where they will say, if you do 30 rides in the next 48 hours, we'll give you an extra $40. But it's the carrot on the stick, because if you don't get all 30, you get nothing. But at the same time, you're incentivized to get your trip count up, so you will take the cheap ones just to get your trip count up.
Okay. Back to Mr. Hamel, how much, and this is an average, and if you don't have the number, I'd ask that you would get back to the committee on it, but how much money per kilometer does the average Uber driver earn per kilometer?
Merci.
Thank you. If I may, quickly, I'll come back to your question, but some things have been said I'd like to come back to. The fact that a driver or delivery person...
Well, I'll give you a minute to do so, but then I would like to move to the question that I just posed to you.
Well, the problem est,
The problem, Mr. Hamel, is that there isn't a full minute left. There's just 30 seconds. If you'd like to answer Mr. Cooper's question, please do that. Please answer Mr. Cooper's question. I don't have that information in front of me. We will provide it to the committee. The acceptance rate of drivers and delivery persons has no impact, nor does previous consumer patterns.
Mr. Hamel, it's my time, and I just would put on the record that I would be very interested to see what that rate of return is and how that compares to CRA's mileage allowance.
Yeah, I'll make sure that the clerk follows up. That's question number 4 for Monsieur Hamel. I'll make sure that the clerk follows up on Mr. Cooper's question. We're going to go to Mr. Baines. You have 6 minutes, Mr. Baines. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. And I will say there's been several very, very good pointed questions and a lot of information coming out from this study, which is, fundamentally we're trying to figure out And the concern for me is, are workers, drivers, gig workers being exploited? But at the same time, customers and consumers, are they being exploited? And what I think one of the key things we see in algorithms or these types of models or different industries, all different sectors, are the fees, the hidden fees and junk fees. So I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about that. If you're with respect to driving up costs, like what methodologies do you use for every single fee that is associated with a ride? And we're seeing it, concert ticket sales, we see it Uber, Lyft, rideshare, delivery apps. So if you can sort of, in an answer, try to indicate what kind of methodology or algorithm you formulate for these fees. Do they go up and down? Or are they relative to whatever the ride is? And if you cannot, I'd like an itemized fee structure or methodology or algorithm that you use in writing later on. So if you could maybe explain, and if not, and in addition, actually, I would like to see maybe an itemized list of how you determine those hidden or junk fees. That's to Mr. Hamel.
Merci.
Thank you. Both with Uber Eats and Uber, the consumer sees all fees before placing the order or requesting the ride. When you open the app, there's a note indicating that there's a service charge and delivery charges. When you're on a restaurant page, you see the delivery fee posted and the service fee posted. It is between $2 and $4 for all provinces. It can vary. So all fees are very transparently displayed before a consumer orders.
But do they, when you talk about the varying of those fees, do they escalate or de-escalate based on the cost of the item, or is it a standard set fee? Yeah, that's a question.
Donc, on va prendre.
Let's take Uber Eats as an example. The main portion of the order cost comes from the items ordered. Then there's a delivery fee, which is very clearly indicated. And that delivery fee can vary somewhat depending on distance from the restaurant.
Does it go up or down?
Le frais de livraison ne varie pas selon le prix de l'item. Maintenant, le frais de service, lui, va varier en en proportion de l'ensemble de la taille de la commande, tout en étant entre 2 et 4 dollars. Puis je répète, tout ça est affiché là, avant même qu'on sélectionne le restaurant, c'est affiché. Puis quand on sélectionne le restaurant d'où on veut commander, c'est clairement affiché le prix qui sera celui de livraison et les frais de service.
Mr. Baines, I stopped your time. We had a little bit of problem with translation there, so we're just trying to figure it out.
Can we do a test?
I am going to hold off on your time right now and allow Mr. Hamel to repeat what he had just said for the benefit of the members around the committee based on the question that you asked. Go ahead. Allez, s'il vous plaît, Mr. Hamel, répondez.
Please go ahead, Mr. Hamel. Please answer the question put by Mr. Baines. I'll do my best. Delivery fees are not based on the size of the order, but the service fee which will be between $2 and $4, does vary with the item cost. But let's be clear, before the consumer selects the first item on a given menu, on the restaurant page, the delivery fee is clearly shown, as is the service fee, which is clearly indicated as falling between $2 and $4. It can vary, but before you confirm the order, you will see exactly what it is, $2.85, and you'll see the service fee as well, very precisely.
Okay, I'm going to go to Ms. Bednar because you did talk about junk fees and you have some expertise in that manner. Similar to the questions I asked to Mr. Hamel, if you could maybe expand on what your thoughts are and what you studied in this and how it may relate to these gig economies.
Of course, thank you. So just because you see a junk fee doesn't mean that it isn't junk. Right? So they're often dressed up with quite fancy names. I believe in BC starting last week, the fee was regulatory recapture fee. You'll know better than me. And that was in response to legislation in BC mandating more of a wage floor. So that fee was passed on to people. Does that make it junk? Maybe, maybe not. But the fluctuations of those fees suggest that it is part of a company's pricing strategy in terms of extracting the maximum value from people. And in the same way that we've seen this kind of great unbundling of pricing, and kudos to Canada, because 2 years ago we outlawed drip pricing, so you have to advertise, as we've heard, the full price up front. You cannot add fees on as you go through kind of a checkout. We've seen an unbundling of work. So typically when we employ someone, say at my water store as a cashier, there's a premium on their time. I'm paying them an hourly rate. Uber and companies like it have unbundled work so that you're paid for time on task. Now, the theory is to only pay that cashier when they're ringing items through, instead of paying them for their time being at your beck and call, on call for you. And that's part of this larger kind of erosion and conversation that we're having about accessing rides and accessing delivery. I veered away from junk fees, sorry.
That's okay.
It's okay.
Mr. Baines, we're over time here. So, Monsieur Villemure, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Mr. Villemure, you have 6 minutes. Mr. Hamel, does Uber subscribe to the European Privacy Protection Directive? Uber has a policy that's in compliance with all Canadian regulations and which is also in compliance with European standards. Thank you. Ms. Bednar, conceptually, is Uber a responsible stakeholder in society, actor in society?
It's a big question about Uber. Are they a responsible innovator? I do appreciate that these fees specifically, that could be junk-ish, are transparent in terms of they exist and people see that there's a fee. But I do not think that there's transparency in terms of precisely where that fee goes, how it's calculated, or why it seems to be so volatile. And to my mind, that lack of transparency can be irresponsible.
Donc, encore là, du point de vue sociétal.
So there again, on a societal basis, is Uber a good thing or a bad thing?
Je vais préciser ma question un instant.
I'll be more specific. There is a demand for Uber. But the fact that there is demand doesn't necessarily justify exploitation of a market, employees, or contract employees. So that's the perspective from which I'm asking if it's good or bad.
People engage with a company as their wholehearted endorsement of it. And I think we see that people, of course, do want convenience. People want to get around town. People want to order takeout. It's delicious. They want to maybe splurge. I've splurged on having my groceries delivered because I have a toddler at home. But do people want pricing to be transparent, firms to be accountable? the workers that are bringing their items to them to have a wage floor or have access to benefits? Probably, right? So that is part of the conversation that we're having today.
Si vous aviez à émettre 3 recommandations,
If you were to make 3 recommendations, what would they be?
I would suggest that provinces revisit, if I were to make 3 recommendations, I would suggest we revisit capping the commission on grocery delivery as a policy tool that we have, maintaining that there is some subset, but maybe the 30% is too high. I would ask that the determinants of the algorithm that control the access of work are far more transparent. And I would encourage other provinces to consider trying to implement this kind of wage floor that we are seeing pioneered in Ontario and British Columbia, though it does not seem as if it is fully working as effectively as we hoped quite yet.
donc si Uber
So if Uber is seen as a company that's appreciated for its practical advantages, if consumers were better informed about the pricing scales, knowing what the driver is paid, for example, do you think that would have an impact on Uber's business model?
I do. I mean, look, apps of all kinds influence pricing. This kind of micro-calibration is increasingly pervasive in the economy. There was a great story this June. The whole issue of a magazine called The American Prospect focuses on this. And even apps like the Taco Bell app know that I get paid every other Friday. My gordita is going to be more expensive that day, right? I don't think that reflects our values as a society. And the larger worry here outside of this particular case study is that we are moving towards an era where that sticker price doesn't really exist, right? Where we're all getting different prices for different products and services. I do not think that's a future we want.
croyez-vous que Uber fasse partie de ce qu'on appelle
Do you believe Uber is part of capitalism's greatest new trends?
I think that Uber is part of a fascinating moment where in the realm of big data and what we could learn from numbers and how we could influence them, we saw, the growth of this technology and increasingly sophisticated algorithms. And that's been fascinating and that's been important in a lot of ways. But in terms of how these algorithmic tools, how and when they are deployed and who they are accountable to, right? These are rules set by private actors in their favor, ultimately.
Est-ce que vous croyez que c'est normal que Uber
Do you believe it's a normal thing for Uber not to be subject to the European Privacy Protection Directive?
I think on Canadian soil, the best possible privacy legislation that we have is probably what applies, and I do recognize there are higher standards elsewhere. Even better informing people and having that better informed consent doesn't necessarily change the data practices of firms, which fundamentally seems to be what people are revolting against and seem to resent the more they come to build a literacy and familiarity with them.
Mon souci principal, c'est que Uber possède une tonne de données.
My primary concern is that Uber hoovers up massive amounts of data. Those data are protected, but if they were to leak, the impact would be tremendous. There's a risk, huge risk.
There are cybersecurity and privacy risks, but I think those are almost the secondary concern to the real foundation, which is how information, both that we volunteer and that is abstracted or collected around us, is used. We heard that this data is not sold, but access to this data is, right? Ads, specials, offers targeted, special to you in an app are a way that these platforms facilitate kind of advertising through the information that they have in kind of similar micro-targeting. I'm feeling like I'm using a lot of jargon unintentionally, so I apologize for that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Ms. Bednar, Mr. Villemure. Mr. Green, 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I think like a lot of things, I can recall being a city councillor when Uber first came in and disrupted the then, I would call it a taxi cartel in Hamilton, quite frankly, the way in which plates and licenses were distributed. It disrupted it, it drove that market into a bit of a frenzy, and has found a bunch of ways to really circumvent local laws, bylaws, licensing around transportation. Ms. Bednar, can you you spoke about the digital public infrastructure, and I'm really stuck on that. Can you talk about the way that could be a remedy that would allow for the scenario I suggested to Mr. Wedge, where the people who actually provide the value, the workers, get the greatest return on their work? So worker-owned co-ops, or the way in which there could be government state interventions to level the playing field for what is otherwise a deeply exploitative technology.
Sure. I mean, there are alternative business models that are being experimented with, that we've seen success with. You've already sort of mentioned them in terms of the cooperative element. I guess I think we need to stop acting surprised if and when the private sector doesn't always act in the public interest. And if we're going to be a society moving forward that sees delivery, right, and sees rides and drives as part of this, then we need to think together about how we want to facilitate that, and if we want it to be more of what's veering towards a private monopoly. A report also from, you were mentioning reports coming out, is it from the City of Toronto or a proposal in the City of Toronto? I'm going to get it incorrect. Is now looking back at that kind of digital medallion system and suggesting the capping of that supply. So to me, we're actually reinventing that taxi system, perhaps, because if one of the problems that we're talking about here with supply and demand is there's an oversupply of drivers, which then also depreciates the rate, then yes, one of those potential policy proposals could be that workers agree to limit that. It is my understanding that sometimes these platforms, these programs, also try to penalize or understand if on the same phone you are driving for two competing companies, which also removes agency and the kind of worker mobility we might expect these people to have, that their own choice as workers.
I know we've done at least my colleagues have done a decent job trying to get answers out of the PR person from Uber, but we haven't talked about Amazon. And quite frankly, when you look at logistics and the gig economy, Amazon plays a huge role in this new evolution of work. We heard the story from Mr. Wedge about the newcomer. I think it'd be a surprise to no one around the table that a very pressing issue is temporary foreign workers, international students. So on one hand, having a low barrier to entry is very good. People who want to work, they show up to work. They can do it with little oversight, regulation, or verification, quite frankly. If they're contractors, I would imagine Uber probably doesn't even check the legality, even if they're able to work. But I digress. The point is that what should we be learning from this moment in terms of the labor market and the ways in which these technologies can exploit workers, pitting workers against workers by flooding a certain market and driving down the compensation for other drivers?
I mean, in terms of barriers to entry for entry-level work or certain types of work, there was an experiment in the U.S. where, I can't remember the fast food outlet, and I'm cognizant I keep mentioning fast food, I might be hungry, but where they said, actually applying to work with us is going to become a lottery. If you meet this threshold, we believe we can train you. We don't need to go through all these other extra elements. And I think that is actually a reflection of kind of a learning of some of these entry points. But back to that datafication of work, right? Using computer programs to push workers in particular ways. I don't think Amazon delivery drivers are urinating in bottles or defecating in the back of their truck for fun. They are doing that because they are under pressure, such severe pressure, to do a certain amount of delivery in a certain amount of time. We've even seen Amazon invent glasses that they can wear, that they might be mandated to wear, that can shave seconds off each delivery by telling them in their lens exactly where to go. Now, you could argue that's good business and that's efficiency and that's productivity, and you could also look at the stress and the health effects of that work.
Yeah, I would call it techno-fascism, but those are my words, not yours. The reason why it's important, to look at the ways in which people can be exploited. In previous studies, it became very apparent that AI had biases that were baked in, biases around gender and race and demographics. From your subject matter expertise and experience, is there a scenario, like Mr. Wedge talked about, the newcomer, where people are exploited because they show certain demographic markers that might make them more susceptible or more vulnerable to take lower rates than what otherwise would be kind of a blind pricing system?
Yes, it's possible to imagine that occurring, just as when you were mentioning the quests or the gamification of work, right? We've heard from workers that it seems like, if there's an incentive to do 40 drives in 24 hours, that the closer you get to 40, the harder it can be to find work, so that there's a feeling that there's a lack of transparency or an almost exploitation with those incentives as well. And that has not, implications for fairness and transparency, but also for trust and stress and that relationship that people have with these. I call them computer programs because I worry sometimes when we use the phrasing around algorithmic, it makes it seem so much fancier than it really is.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate you being here, and I wish we got more answers. I'm going to say this, Mr. Chair, out of our Uber rep. I would digress and say that in future scenarios where we don't get direct answers, I just want folks to know that I'll be moving motions to pull the president in. If the presidents don't have answers, then we got another problem. But sending PR people to these committees, quite frankly, wastes our time. I'm just going to say that on the record.
Okay.
Thank you.
I appreciate that, Mr. Green. That concludes those 6-minute rounds. So I'm going to leave it at the will of the committee, and I'm going to go around the table. You fine, Monsieur Villemure? Vous êtes content?
Is that all right, Mr. Villemure?
Mr. Barrett's good. I know, Ms. Khalid, you had a question that you'd like to ask, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, Chair, I was wondering if it's possible for us to perhaps submit written questions to the witnesses. I know that we are short on time. For us to perhaps get some written responses back to our questions.
Yeah.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, and that's fine. I'm not sure we're short on time, but I understand Ms. Bednar and Mr. Wedge have flights to catch this evening. We did get off 40 minutes late, so if the committee members want to submit some questions, we'll make sure submit them to the clerk, and we'll make sure that we distribute them to the appropriate people for response. Okay?
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that.
Mr. Fisher.
Thank you very much. And I asked our wonderful clerk earlier to give me an update on the request by the committee for the X documents.
Yeah.
And for the benefit of the rest of the committee, I would love it if the clerk would give us that update once again, just so that it's not just me getting that update.
Yeah, so the request was made to Twitter, and I don't want to take anything away from you, Madam Clerk. The request was made to Twitter. They were given until tomorrow to respond, which is 7 days, and we are waiting for their response. So we're going to give them till tomorrow, and then I can update the committee. We haven't received anything at this point, but I can update the committee if we do get a response through the clerk as well. So just a couple of things. Thank you for that question, Mr. Fisher. A couple of things I want to mention just on the invitation list. We had Lyft and DoorDash. They have proposed to provide written submissions to the committee. I'm just telling you what's going on here. And then Skip the Dishes, we haven't heard from at this point, but we expect to hear from them soon. And just for Thursday's business, I've got the Privacy Commissioner coming for a second attempt at an appearance, and the notice will be going out soon. I do have a committee budget that I would like to approve on this study, but before I do that, Mr. Wedge, I want to thank you for appearing before the committee today. Ms. Bednar, I know you told me, sidebar, that this was your first appearance at a committee. In person, okay.
I've been on the computer.
Okay, perfect. So I want to thank you for
Thank you.
taking the time to be here at the committee. And Monsieur Hamel, merci aussi pour votre...
Mr. Hamel, thank you for your time today. As I said, the clerk will send out questions from the committee. I believe there are 4 questions for you, but there may be more if Ms. Khalid has some.
Hamel for being here. And I'm going to exclude the witnesses from this discussion. Thank you so much. We have a proposed budget on this study of, and I know this wasn't on the agenda, but I have to deal with it, $8,750 on Uber rides, on Uber Eats, on right. I'm a strong fiscal conservative when it comes to meals. We've got expenses of witnesses: Hamilton, Montreal, Scarborough, Toronto. Headsets, of course, are $250 each. Every time we send out a headset, in this case, that represents about $2,000. Okay, so yeah, and then working meals. I'm not sure how we got up to this price. but $500 each on that. So I've got 87. I saw Mr. Barrett. Any questions on the budget? Mr. Barrett moved it. Are we good? Good, good. Okay, so the budget is approved. Thank you for that. Meeting's adjourned. We'll see everybody on Thursday. Thank you.